Coolidge and the Enchanted Dagger, a Mosaic and Koven Chronicles short story by Andrea Pearson. Copyright 2019, Andrea Pearson. Coolidge clenched his hands together, trying not to fidget as he waited for the man sitting across from him to deliver the report. This was the third doctor he'd seen regarding two separate sets of MRIs. With how his luck had been recently, it would yet again end up a complete waste of time and money. He closed his eyes. If only the man would say, "Your scans are clean. I have no idea why you haven't restarted yet," but Coolidge knew better than to hope for that. What he did hope for was that whatever the doctor ended up telling him would be something fixable. Finally, Dr. Hess broke the silence and met Coolidge's eyes with a grave expression. "I'm sorry, son, but I agree with my colleagues." Coolidge swallowed, his stomach dropping. "In which way do you agree with them?" "Your pineal gland is underdeveloped." He waited for Dr. Hess to continue, but the man didn't say anything else. "And what does that mean to you?" The doctor removed his glasses, folding them up before putting them in his front pocket. "The same thing it does to everyone else. Your magic will never develop. It's physically impossible." Coolidge's shoulders slumped. Why had this happened to him? After the first doctor's diagnosis, he'd spent hours reading up on the condition. He'd refused to believe it was his condition. He'd found and interviewed others who'd received the same diagnosis. Nothing fixed it. No hormonal therapies, no medication, nothing. Nausea built up in Coolidge's stomach, threatening to enter his throat. "But I don't understand. How is it possible? Both my parents are Aretes. My mom restarted when she was 15, and my dad when he was 16. I should already have my magic." The doctor only shook his head. "I'm sorry, son. I really am. Can we do a transplant of some sort?" Dr. Hess blinked. "Of course not. It would have to come from a donor with the same hair color as yours and the same age. It would also need to come from someone who hasn't restarted yet. The chances of us finding a person who fits that criteria are very slim. Not to mention the fact that magic is inherited. Yes, a lot of it is physical and originates in how your brain developed as a child, but some of it does come from ancestors. We would never find the right pineal gland." Coolidge felt the back of his eyes tickle. He would not cry right now. He was 19, not 7. "There's nothing I can do." The doctor shook his head. "If something else develops, headaches, dizziness, sudden weight gain, problems sleeping too much or too little, that sort of thing, we can set up an appointment with an endocrinologist and figure out if there's any medication that would treat the underdeveloped gland." He raised his hands, stopping Coolidge from responding just yet. "But no treatment exists that would address the magic problem." Dr. Hess got to his feet and shook Coolidge's hand, pulling him up in the process before stepping to his door and opening it. "Again, I'm sorry. I hate delivering bad news. If you have any questions after you've churned my answers over, feel free to set up another appointment." Coolidge mumbled a thanks and left the office, feeling as everything crashed down around him with a finality that hadn't been there after the first or second appointments. He would never, ever do magic. Coolidge got into his car, locked the doors, and buckled up before resting his hands on the steering wheel and staring out the windshield. What was he going to do? How was he supposed to move forward? Everything he'd ever desired and expected revolved around magic. Every career he'd considered, every place he wanted to visit, even almost every friend he'd had, they all had to do with magic. It was what he dreamt about growing up. Partly because of his own hopes and plans, but also because of his parents. They were some of the most powerful Aretes alive, and they were so excited for their son and his future that brimmed with magic. No, he didn't worry they'd be upset. They weren't those types of parents, the ones who expected and pressured children to be just like them. But they would be disappointed for him. He couldn't tell them just yet. He wasn't ready to deal with his frustration and disappointment, and theirs. Luckily, they were at home, halfway across the country from his university, and he could put off letting them know for a bit longer. Coolidge shoved a fist against his eyes again when he realized the day hadn't ended. He still had to meet with the magical items 101 Ta. Because AD wasn't close enough to passing for his professor. Not that he'd expected it to be, but still. The guy had been a jerk about it. He'd been a jerk since Coolidge's first assignment, and Coolidge had no idea why. A glance at the clock told him he'd be late if he didn't leave right then, and Coolidge turned on the car before pulling out of the parking lot, pushing his diagnosis to the back of his mind. He'd have to deal with it later. After he dropped out of college. The thought made his stomach clench. The first 5 or so minutes with the Ta went fine, but soon, Coolidge's brain couldn't shut off about what the doctor had said. Transplants weren't possible. Hormonal treatments wouldn't help. His magic literally had no way of coming. He'd never felt so powerless and out of control in his life. Every avenue had been shut to him, his future now gone. It didn't take long for the Ta to notice his distraction. "You've really got a knack for this stuff," she said, trying to draw him back. "I know you haven't restarted yet, but magical items are attracted to you." She motioned to the table full of toys, household things, and random knickknacks, all of which had been charged magically at some point. He glanced at her, feeling himself intrigued despite his dark thoughts. "These things don't just respond to anyone," she said, seemingly encouraged by his response. "In fact, I've never seen them reach out for anyone. Warm up, yes, but not reach for. Not even to people who are fully restarted and know what their focus is. I can seriously sense their excitement when you're around. It's really cool." Coolidge knitted his eyebrows. "What are you saying?" She fully met his gaze. "You have a gift. You might not have power yet, but you're definitely talented." A concerned expression crossed her face. "You can't let Professor Wilson get in the way of your success. You guys butt heads so much more than anyone I've seen, and it's slowing you down. It's taking away all of your focus." Coolidge tossed his pen on the table. "It doesn't even matter. None of it does, this magic stuff." The Ta tilted her head, frowning. "What do you mean?" "I got an MRI, too, in fact." I know. 19, and not having restarted isn't exactly rare. But my parents both restarted much earlier than normal, and I wanted to make sure there wasn't something wrong. Well, there is. Apparently, my pineal gland is underdeveloped." The Ta frowned. "I don't understand how that affects anything." He wasn't surprised. He hadn't either, at first. Magic comes from the pineal gland. If that gland isn't developed, magic can't develop. Is that possible? I don't believe it. Did you get a second opinion? Yes, and a third. And 2 MRIs, like I said. And I did a lot of my own studying. The answer has been the same across the board. I will never be able to use magic." The Ta got to her feet and paced the room, obviously agitated. Coolidge struggled with tracking her movements. He was too depressed from what he'd learned to get agitated along with her. When she spoke again, it wasn't words of sympathy she uttered. What she said totally took him back. "I've heard of something that might help. An enchanted dagger. I don't know though, Coolidge. It's dangerous." She paused, taking a deep breath. "The dagger supposedly grants an Aretes magic they wouldn't have otherwise once every 1,000 years. It hasn't been mentioned for much longer than that, but if what I've studied is accurate, that means it's due another granting soon." She leaned over the desk in front of him, staring directly into his eyes. "Go talk to Professor Wilson. Ask him about it." He opened his mouth to respond, but she lifted a hand, silencing him. "It's not going to be easy." Coolidge raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I know. He and I don't exactly like each other." She gave him a confused expression before smiling and shaking her head. No. That's not what I'm talking about. This enchanted dagger. From what I've read, you have to be willing to do crazy things for it to work." "There isn't anything I'm not willing to do," Coolidge said, getting to his feet. "Is he in his office now?" He wasn't sure if he should believe her about the dagger, but he was desperate to follow every avenue. Professor Wilson? I think so. She looked at her watch. He should be there for another 20 minutes. Good. Thank you. Coolidge left the room, heading toward the professor's office. He knocked on the door and ran a hand through his hair, trying to maintain a pleasant expression despite the guy on the other side. With a bit of satisfaction, he noted the look of frustration on Professor Wilson's face when the man opened up and saw who was on the other side. The feeling was definitely mutual. Mr. Coolidge, Professor Wilson said, opening the door wider. What a pleasant surprise. Coolidge didn't miss the sarcasm in his instructor's voice. Come on in, he said, returning to the chair behind his large mahogany desk. What can I do for you? Your Ta was just telling me about an enchanted dagger that can help me get my powers. The professor raised his eyebrows and stared at his student. And why would you need to use an enchanted item to get your magic? Coolidge explained about the diagnosis all three doctors had given him. And you believe a dagger would help get past this dilemma? I don't know. I only just heard about it, so I haven't had time to study. But I'm willing to do anything. Besides, your Ta said it's possible. Of course it is. He shuffled papers on his desk. I'm not inclined to let you use it, though. Wait, you have it. And why wouldn't you let me use it? Because you're lazy. The words rolled so smoothly off the man's tongue that Coolidge wondered if he'd rehearsed them. You don't push yourself. I don't have any magic. Professor Wilson looked Coolidge in the eyes for several moments. It doesn't matter. You should be getting a B in my class without powers. I don't know what's going on, but you have a huge amount of potential, and you're not doing anything with it. His frown deepened. You probably wonder why I seem hostile toward you. I know who your parents are. I know where you come from. And I also know that children of parents like yours tend to be spoiled and lack self-discipline. You have so much potential, Mr. Coolidge, and you're wasting it. I'm not wasting anything. And I don't lack self-discipline. Then why aren't you getting a B? Coolidge gritted his teeth. He was about to say, because my teacher is a jerk, but he stopped himself in time. He knew better than to be disrespectful like that. I've discussed you with your other professors. You're not doing well in any of your classes. You what? We regularly discuss students who show potential, but do nothing with it. You want to know why? Because it drives us nuts. No one likes having a possible prodigy on their hand who squanders their talent. Coolidge's mouth fell open. He'd never had anyone talk to him like this before. He didn't know whether to slug the instructor or threaten to sue. Obviously, he wouldn't do either, but the temptation was strong. Professor Wilson steepled his fingers. There's something about you. A difference around you. Something that tells me you'll have plenty of opportunity to help a lot of people during your lifetime. But not if you don't learn to apply and discipline yourself. To direct your talents and abilities. Coolidge leaned his elbows on his knees and stared at the threadbare carpet. Something about the earnestness in his professor's voice calmed his angry emotions down, and he felt the need for honesty. I get bored. I go down rabbit holes, studying in-depth things that are briefly mentioned in lectures. I know a lot more than what is being taught, but because it doesn't follow class outlines, it doesn't help me with tests and assignments. He raised his gaze to his teacher. I'm not lazy, I just want to focus on things that interest me. Professor Wilson nodded. I understand. I was that way too. But I also learned how to make it work with what I studied, and my grades didn't suffer as a result. Coolidge shook his head slowly. Either way, my potential doesn't matter if I can't develop my magic. He looked up again. Don't you see? I want to be good at all of this. I want to learn what is being taught. And I definitely don't want anything to hold me back. But my magic is never going to come. I can't graduate or move forward if I don't have powers. Call me crazy, but I feel like my entire future hinges on this. Like I won't ever fulfill my life calling if I miss out on something most Aretes take for granted. Professor Wilson stared at Coolidge for several moments, as if he were weighing his opinion on the current Coolidge versus what he thought of Coolidge's future. I don't know if I believe you. He got up and walked to the corner of the office, unlocking and opening a huge armoire. It doesn't matter if I believe you, though. It only matters if she does. She who? Coolidge asked. Professor Wilson turned to face him, holding a beautiful dagger with a brilliant red rose at the top of the hilt. This is what my Ta was telling you about. He stared at Coolidge for a moment. Did she warn you it would be difficult? I hope so. Yes, she did. Good. Because in order to access its powers, you must stab yourself in the heart. What? If you survive, you'll know you were found worthy and you'll be granted your magic. Are you kidding? Professor Wilson didn't blink. Of course not. Coolidge swallowed, his eyes straying to the red rose and down the little golden vine tendrils that seemed to practically grow out of the hilt. It was a beautiful weapon. What are the chances I'll survive? How did that question even leave Coolidge's mouth? Was he really considering doing it? That's up to her. Professor Wilson took his seat again, setting the dagger on the desk in front of him before meeting Coolidge's eyes. You said you were willing to do anything to gain your magic. Were you telling the truth? I think so. He just hadn't thought that included suicide. Go ahead, pick it up. Coolidge hesitated for a moment before reaching across the desk and grasping the dagger by the dark leather hilt. It warmed in his hand, as all magical items did. The professor nodded. As expected. I've noticed, and not just because my Ta pointed it out. Magical items call to you. If you applied yourself, you could be very successful with them. That would be really great. Coolidge inspected the intricate designs and beautiful blade, feeling as the weapon warmed even more. The workmanship of the rose was especially good. The metal had been dyed blood red, and it shone even under the awful fluorescent lights of Professor Wilson's office. As he looked at the dagger, Coolidge felt something he'd never sensed before. A presence in his brain. Without asking, he knew it came from the enchanted item. Do you really want this? A woman's voice asked. I don't know. I don't know if I'm willing to kill myself. The moment the words had been formed in his brain, Coolidge knew he would do whatever it took, though. Determination filled his heart, and he gritted his teeth. Yes, I do want it. I need my powers. Very well. All fear and hesitation drained from his system. Without thinking, his hands raised of their own accord. More determination flooded his system. He couldn't tell if the feeling came from himself or the dagger. Just who was controlling him? Did it matter? Before he could finish following that vein of thought, he plunged the blade into his own heart. Shock widened his eyes. He fell to the floor. The last thing he saw was the worried expression on Professor Wilson's face. And then the world turned black. Coolidge opened his eyes. It took a moment for him to focus on his surroundings, and when he did, he scrambled to a sitting position, his jaw dropping. He was in a massive room full of translucent people. Ghosts. Oh no. Coolidge lurched to his feet, wanting to run but unsure which direction to go. Had he died? Had he failed without knowing the trial had begun? He pushed forward, trying to find an exit to this insane room, but only got even more disoriented. Coolidge froze, unsure of what to do, and laughter like the tinkling of bells sounded behind him. He turned. The most beautiful woman he'd ever seen watched him. She glowed, and not just because of the translucent ghost look. Everything about her was magical. Her golden long hair, the elaborate beautiful blue dress she wore, even the diamonds that sparkled at her throat and ears transfixed him. She was gorgeous. My dagger has brought you to me. And now your heart must be weighed to find if you are worthy. She reached to Coolidge, touching his chest, and before he could say or do anything, she dug her fingers through his skin and pulled out his heart. He gasped, glancing down. A gaping hole greeted him. There was no blood, no gore, no pain. What? The woman didn't respond. A scale appeared next to her, and she placed Coolidge's heart in one side of it, causing both sides to tip and teeter. She watched for a moment. You are pure in heart. But does that make you worthy of the power you so strongly desire? She looked at him, her gaze piercing. What are you willing to sacrifice? He swallowed. He'd already stabbed himself in the heart. Everything else paled in comparison to that. Anything. The woman raised an eyebrow. Okay, I don't want to do anything illegal. Like murdering. Or robbing. Or other stuff like that. The woman nodded. This answer seemed to satisfy her. You will have the opportunity to sacrifice of yourself and your time by mentoring and helping people who struggle, magically. Do you swear to help them? Coolidge's chest warmed with conviction. Yes. I do. He knew, though, that he didn't need to promise this woman anything. He would have done it anyway. The amount of stress he'd experienced the past 4 years had solidified a strong desire to help if he ever found someone who struggled with their powers the way he had. The scales tipped heavily in his favor. Very well. The woman blew on his heart, and he felt it warm and start beating, even though it was still outside his body. She picked it up and returned it to his chest, then pressed 2 fingers against both sides of his head behind and above his ears. And then he blacked out again. When he awakened, he was still lying on the ugly carpet in Professor Wilson's office. Something was different this time, though. He couldn't figure out what. Professor Wilson was working intently at his desk, marking and shuffling through papers. He yelped when Coolidge sat up, then laughed. Looks like I didn't waste the dagger's 1,000-year use on you. Coolidge looked down at his chest. The only thing that remained of his experience was a ragged hole in his shirt. The skin underneath was completely healthy. But still, something was different. He felt whole, as if he were in one piece when he hadn't been before. Professor Wilson watched him expectantly. Coolidge couldn't get anything else out. A strange tickling flooded over him, pulsing stronger and originating from Professor Wilson. It gave him goosebumps when he realized what he'd just sensed. His jaw dropped. I can feel your magical pulses. He closed his eyes for a moment, sensing his own powers swirling around him, begging him to release them, to use them. He had access to his magic. When he opened his eyes again, he saw that his professor was smiling. Congratulations on your restart. A serious expression settled on the older man's face. As long as you do as you promised, your gifts will always be available. Don't misuse them, and don't forget what you gave your word on. To both me and the woman. I won't. Professor Wilson got to his feet and opened the door, ushering Coolidge out. You've got a lot of work to do to get caught up. You'd better get to work. Coolidge agreed. He left his professor's office with a bounce to his step he hadn't had for a long time. He would focus on his studies. He would graduate with a 4.0 GPA. He would study magical items and find out what made them want to be near him so much. Nothing would stop him from becoming the most powerful Arete the world had ever seen. His future had finally opened up before him, and he found his entire body warming with the thought of helping others find their way too. He couldn't wait to get started. This has been Coolidge and the Enchanted Dagger by Andrea Pearson. Thank you for listening. Would you like to know what was on Austin's mind when he first met Nicole? Why he was so annoyed with her? Austin's Perception, the audiobook, is available only to members of Andrea's Readers Group. Click the link in the description for more information.